I'm Jan Fox, and it's my great honor to co-chair the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. My co-chair is here. There he is, Dave Dixon. Give everybody a wave. Hi, Dave. And on behalf of CMNCP, I'm really excited to welcome you to this very timely webinar on preventing violence in the home during and after lockdowns, and the official launch of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention's Peaceful Homes Report. So pretty exciting day for us, and thanks, we're really pleased with the turnout as well. But before we begin, I have the honor of being able to do a land acknowledgement. So today I'm joining you from Treaty 6, which is the traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling place of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux. It's also the home for Métis Region 4. And I know that people are joining me from all across Turtle Island. So please, if you want to put in the chat, tell us where you're from. We always love to see that. So thank you for doing that. So today I'm speaking to you from Amiskwashi Waskagan, which is the Cree name for Edmonton. And I just want to talk a little bit about Treaty 6. Specifically, Treaty 6 is an agreement between the Crown and First Nations. It was signed on August 23rd, 1876 at Fort Carleton. For those of you who don't know, that is in between Prince Albert and Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And then again on September 9th, the same year at Fort Pitt. So the reason that we do land acknowledgements is to honor those who have come before us and those who have worked so hard to safeguard this land we now share and call home. Also, it's to celebrate the amazing connection Indigenous people have to the land, and in fact, to celebrate the amazing gift that Indigenous people are to all of us. I recently learned of the theory of two-eyed seeing, using both eyes to see the world, Indigenous ways and Western ways, to co-create a better future. Many of us also have deep connections to the land, to the mountains, to the lakes, streams, forests. To me, the land represents growth, hope, change, and a place where everyone feels a sense of belonging and equality. We live among a layer of history and human connections that make up our sense of space. Land acknowledgements also remind us of the importance of the intentional act of relationshiping, building relationships so we can co-create a better future together. It calls to mind too, for me, the collective work of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, which is really about building relationships and learning from one another. There's a word in Cree, it's wahotowin, which denotes the interconnected nature of relationships, community, and natural systems. Again, the essence of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. And I think I want it to call to mind too. And when I present protocol to Elder Verna McGregor, I will also ask that she pray for us around this very, very incredibly important work about preventing violence in our homes, because we know that this is just become of epidemic proportions. So I'm grateful to all the people who are here today. But when I think of the land acknowledgement, I think of its significance to the work that we're embarking upon today as well. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you today Elder Vernon McGregor, who is from the Algonquin community of Kitigan Zibi Anishwabek. And that community is approximately 120 kilometers north of Ottawa. Elder Verna works at the Minawashin Lodge, the Aboriginal Women's Support Center, which is also located in Ottawa, and which services to Aboriginal women who are victims of and are leaving violence. Elder Verna has remained firmly grounded in her community and nation by also being part of the group of traditional grandmothers and elders. This includes promoting the retention of the Algonquin language and culture, which is so important when addressing issues and connections to the land. And I have received permission from Elder McGregor to present to her protocol virtually. This is obviously not the preferred way, but Elder Vernon, I have for you tobacco that I want to present. And in so doing, I'm asking that you pray for and preside over this meeting today to give us the strength and grounding to move forward on this very important work. I think I noticed that you are smudging in the background, and I thank you for that. It's always something that grounds me as well. What I will do with this tobacco following this meeting is I will take it to a place that's very special to me. I actually live in a community called St. Albert, Alberta, which is founded by Métis people. And there's a place by the Sturgeon River where I walk, and in that place is a monument to survivors of residential schools. So I will put it in the river and say a prayer for you and for these proceedings, since we can't present it in person. So first, I'm really happy to see Heidi Illenworth here with us today. She, of course, is with the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime. Heidi has extensive experience in the victim services field. Prior to her appointment as the Federal Ombudsman, she spent 20 years in frontline service delivery for victims of serious crime and interpersonal violence. She served as the executive director of the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime for over 11 years, and also developed and taught courses in the postgraduate victimology program at Algonquin College for 6 years. She's been a strong advocate for victims of crime, developing a number of resources to help support victim services providers, as well as individuals and victims of crime and their families. And we're really pleased to have partnered with her on this important work. Next, I'm very excited to introduce to you Shannon Turner. Shannon is the current executive director of the Public Health Association of British Columbia. Shannon has more than 35 years experience in public health practice, healthy public policy, health promotion, program and project management, strategic planning, conducting research on digital communication, and citizen engagement, just to name a few of the many areas she's worked in. Shannon is currently serving as the co-chair of Prevention of Violence Canada and as chair of the World Health Organization Vaccine Safety Net. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Shannon here today. Next, we have Dr. Lana Wells. Lana is the associate professor and the Brenda Stratford Chair in the Prevention of Domestic Violence at the Faculty of Social Work, University of Calgary, where she is leading a primary prevention initiative called SHIFT, the Project to End Domestic Violence. Lana actively supervises graduate students within the Faculty of Social Work and the School of Public Policy, where in 2012, she became a research fellow and instructor. Her passion includes advocating for the prevention of family and sexual violence, advancing gender equality and equality, developing social policies to prevent and respond to complex social issues, preventing teen dating violence, advancing social justice, and creating transformational change. So before we hear from all of our speakers, I'm going to hand it over to Audrey, who is with us as the Director of Project and Research at the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, to provide a bit of background and overview on the Peaceful Homes. But you can just tell by the bios of these amazing women that I've introduced that we're going to have a great conversation. So over to you, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Jen. Also, huge thank you to Elder McGregor for the opening prayer, and thanks to everyone who's here today, who has joined for this webinar. As Jen mentioned, my name is Audrey Manette. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of Projects and Research for CMNCP. And I'm joining you today from Gatineau, Quebec, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. So as Jen mentioned, before handing it over to our speakers, I'd like to kind of officially introduce everyone to CMNCP's Peaceful Homes Report, which focuses on the prevention of violence in the home during and after lockdowns. So as Jan mentioned a little bit earlier in her presentation, CMNCP does serve as a community of practice for communities across the country. And I really want to mention that this report is the result of a number of communities coming together, identifying the urgency of this issue, and putting their heads together to kind of address it, or start brainstorming some ways to address it. And in that regard, I want to take a couple of minutes to acknowledge the contributions of a number of people who have supported this project, who helped develop the report. So first, thank you to our co-chairs, Shannon Turner and Corinne Lightning Earl, who have championed this project and who you will have the opportunity to hear from in just a little bit. And I also want to thank the contributors and reviewers who provided feedback, throughout the process of developing the report, who helped clarify and improve the content as well as the scope of the document. I listed all of their names here on the slide, so I really just want to mention that we greatly appreciate their input and just overall ongoing contributions to this work. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and extend a huge thank you to the project funders. So thank you to the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime, the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council, Thunder Bay Crime Prevention Council, as well as Reach Edmonton for the financial support, which really allowed this project to happen and for the report to be completed. And once again, we really value your support and your trust with this project. So just a little bit of background information in terms of how the project came to be. So at the beginning of the pandemic, or just over a year ago, we started having these ongoing conversations internally about, how COVID-19 was testing families across Canada, but also across the world, and how that would have, significant impacts on families and also women and kids and so on. And there was these conversations about situations where women were confined with a violent partner, for example, or thinking about youth. And for example, a youth that comes out to their parents and that doesn't go well. And now that child doesn't have an escape to go to school, for example, and just all these situations that we started thinking about and discussing. And so we started digging a little bit and found that both nationally and internationally, a number of experts and service providers in the field were starting to predict and were already starting to actually observe an increase in violence in the home during COVID-19, which seemed to be based on 4 key factors, essentially. The first one being, of course, confinement of families to the homes. So, these stay-at-home orders and lockdowns. So people having to spend extensive amount of time together in their home. Rising stress and anxiety related to things like, losing a job, financial difficulties, but also just the overall fear of, contracting this new virus that's dangerous and that impacts people's health. The third factor being negative coping mechanisms. So, this increase in substance use, for example. And lastly, the lack of access, both for victims as well as perpetrators, to formal and informal supports. So really this idea that formal support started to be limited because, resources or help centers are closed or their operating hours were limited, but also informal supports because it was often not permitted to see friends and family members in person. So in other words, the COVID-19, emergency or sanitary measures, including stay-at-home orders and lockdowns, started to expose what a lot of us already knew, which is that oftentimes our most intimate spaces, our homes, are not always safe places for a number of people. And then there was research that was done, so for example, by the UN Population Fund, predicting that there would be at least 15 million increased cases of domestic violence across the world for every 3 months that lockdowns were extended. And then a bit more recently, the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice came out with some estimates that in the US, domestic violence incidents had increased over 8% following stay-at-home orders. And worldwide, that number was 20% increases based on UN estimates. So even though it's still unclear how long COVID-19 will affect Canadians directly in terms of the virus being around, the increase in the impact of domestic violence will probably continue to evolve during the different stages of the pandemic. And it's important to recognize that, once the confinement of families will be lifted eventually, the economic long-term effects will probably continue to put pressure and stressors on Canadian families. And that's really why the report focuses on preventing violence in the home, not only during lockdowns, but also after lockdowns. So really that recognition of the potential long-term effects. And it's also important to note that even though the health impact of COVID-19 will probably start declining in the future, violence tends to peak following the COVID-19 curve and then decrease at a slower pace due to the predicted economic hardships. So kind of like what you see on this slide here. So in terms of the scope of the framework or the Peaceful Homes Report, when the project started, it became clear that federal, provincial, territorial, and local orders of government did recognize the need for increased services to support those families that were experiencing violence or that were at the highest level of risk for domestic violence. So we saw things like the federal government's increase in funding for women's shelter, for example, or a number of organizations that had these programs for secure text and chats for people that were experiencing violence or abuse at home. And those types of initiatives became kind of the key focus since the beginning of the pandemic, as they should. This focus and funding towards these initiatives was absolutely crucial since the beginning of the pandemic. But that being said, there was this increasing sense that there was maybe less attention paid to ensuring that conflicts in the home during and after COVID don't escalate to violence among those families that are maybe at a slightly lower level of risk. And that's where our thinking kind of shifted and identified a potential blind spot in the ability to address and to prevent violence. And for that reason, the Peaceful Homes Report really focuses on those homes that have increased risk of conflict escalating to violence, but that have been relatively stable due to, different levels of resilience or protective factors, but that we know that because of COVID, that stability is threatened and could result in a surge of domestic violence that they had not experienced prior to the pandemic. So we created this little visual, as you see on the slide here, and kind of conceptualized it similar to an iceberg, where the tip of the iceberg is where a lot of the attention was being put. So those families that had previously experienced some form of violence. And our focus is really that thin line right under the water where it had been stable so far, and really focusing on preventing it to kind of tip or to spill over and for experience or for violence to appear following COVID-19. And so ultimately, the purpose of the Peaceful Homes Report is really to guide communities in the development of effective approaches to address violence in the home as a result of COVID-19. And so based on a review of research, promising practice, as well as the support of a number of experts and practitioners, the guide really provides a list of general recommendations, as well as a number of programs or initiatives that have been identified as having the most potential to prevent home conflict during the pandemic from escalating. On the slide here, I put kind of an overview of what's included in the Peaceful Homes Report. I'm not going to go through it just for the sake of time. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Heidi Illingworth, the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Good day, everyone. Good afternoon. Bonjour, bon après-midi. My name is Heidi Illingworth, and I am the Ombudsperson for Victims of Crime. I use the pronouns she, her, and elle. I am speaking to you from my home south of Ottawa today on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin people. And I do want to acknowledge Red Dress Day and offer my support to all of the work being done to end the genocide against Indigenous women and girls in Canada. I don't have a presentation, so I'm just gonna speak to you this afternoon a little bit about my office and this important report that was released today. So the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime was created in 2007 as an independent office to provide oversight of the federal government in its dealings with victims of crime. So we serve individuals who've suffered from physical or emotional harm or financial loss as a result of a criminal offense in Canada, as well as those who've been victimized abroad, along with their spouses, their relatives, or dependents. The bulk of what we do at my office is to listen to victims and their families who have concerns about the criminal justice system. Our approach is client-centered and victim-centered, and we also work to identify systemic issues that negatively affect victims, and we provide recommendations and advice to the federal government. I have worked now for more than 20 years with survivors of violence, and I can tell you that prevention is incredibly important to them. Almost every survivor that I talk to says that they want to prevent what happened to them or to their loved one from happening to anyone else. That is why the prevention of victimization is so important to me. I've seen the harm that violence does, and I've walked alongside survivors who are struggling to recover. I've also witnessed their strength and resilience. I'm honored to have been a collaborator on the Peaceful Homes Report, and I commend the hard work of the Canadian Municipal Network for Crime Prevention and the partners who are involved in this well-researched, thorough, and useful guide that has been created. As a former frontline practitioner, I'm really pleased that the guide highlights the severity of domestic and gender-based violence. This form of violence is hidden in the shadows, in private, yet it affects and ripples across and throughout our communities in ways that many are not aware. The guide emphasizes the importance of violence prevention and upstream strategies to interrupt the cycle of violence before it occurs, strategies to which I have long been an avid supporter. It really emphasizes an integrated approach, which I believe is not only important, but also essential to respond effectively to the lasting and damaging harms of violence and trauma. And this is a really timely moment where the COVID-19 pandemic has shined a glaring spotlight on these issues that have gone unaddressed for too long. Every year across Canada, more than 2.2 million crimes are reported to the police, a quarter of which are violent crimes. Yet we know that only a fraction of the violence happening actually comes to the attention of the criminal justice system, of the formal criminal justice system. So crimes like sexual assault remain hidden and are highly underreported, with 95% of victims staying silent. The Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability found that in 2020, 160 women and girls were killed. And of these 160 deaths, 128 of these women, or 80%, were killed by men. Moreover, despite comprising less than 5% of the Canadian population, Indigenous women and girls were overrepresented, comprising 1 in 5 of the women and girls killed. We've heard during the pandemic that national seniors advocates are reporting a 10-fold increase in elder abuse. Child abuse and sexual exploitation is also reportedly on the rise. So the pandemic is really bringing to light all these forms of violence that so many have suffered in silence. And importantly, this moment in time gives us the opportunity to reflect on the way that we actually respond to crime, violence, and trauma as a society. So as we launch this guide today, I'm really hopeful that Canadian municipalities and officials at the local level, at the community level, like Jan said, can begin to implement the strategies shared in the guide to interrupt the damaging cycle of violence that harms so many. They need support from provincial and federal leadership to do so. But the important thing is that we can and we must prevent violence from occurring in the first place. And if we do so, we are going to improve the collective health and well-being of all members of our society. So I support the call to communities, to provincial and territorial representatives, and the federal government to invest now in the provision of adequate and accessible violence prevention programs. Justice system responses have historically been our most important resource or most common response to violence. And we know that we continue to put billions in financial and human resources towards this justice system response. But our criminal justice system is reactive in nature. Policing and incarceration respond after violence has occurred, and they do not prevent it from happening. It doesn't rehabilitate offenders either, and it doesn't help victims deal or heal from the trauma that they have to live with after violent victimization. So for long-term community safety and well-being, and for the health of our society, for the protection of women, children, elders, Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, and the 2S LGBTQ community, we need to dedicate resources to tackling violence at the root, and this guide makes that clear. So how can we stop violence? We need to recognize all of the systemic barriers and inequalities that result or that violence can be the result of: a lack of housing, poverty, food scarcity. These are important drivers of violence, and they need to be addressed through investments, or the cycles of violence will continue. And we know that those who are most vulnerable or most at risk of victimization will never truly be safe from harm if we don't. Those struggling with mental health and addictions, which are also precursors to crime and family violence, they need accessible and timely help and support. And the guide emphasizes the importance of early intervention and prevention to interrupt violence. So practitioners need funds that they can use on the front line now, and they need tools that they can implement. So from greater detection to prevention programming, and many examples of best practices in prevention are found within this guide, demonstrating that there are many innovative tools at our disposal, and we should be implementing them more widely. So just a couple of examples, there's the REACH Immigration and Refugee Initiative, active in Alberta, which works with immigrant and refugee families to target risk factors that place these demographics at higher risk of experiencing family violence in ways that are culturally safe and relevant. There's the Triple P program, active in the United States, to reduce risk factors for child abuse by offering a comprehensive parent training program designed to prevent or alter harmful parenting practices. And then we also know about bystander programs, such as Bringing in the Bystander. And these arm communities with invaluable education and knowledge on family violence and on identifying the signs that someone may be suffering. These programs are applicable to everyone because they're based on the idea that community members can play a role in preventing violence. These practical tools can be applied now in communities, and we need sustaining funding available so that they're supported in communities. And further still, the MMIWG calls for justice offer us Indigenous-led solutions to the cycle of violence, which is why I believe their implementation must be accelerated. And we know that this is critical, given that Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQ folks face the most staggering and disproportional rates of family violence across the country. I do also believe that our justice system responses can be improved to prevent victimization. And presently, I'm calling for the recognition of coercive and controlling behaviors as offenses under the criminal code. Coercive control is a tactic that's used by abusers. It's a harmful pattern of behaviors, including psychological abuse, sexual jealousy, stalking, financial control, and other behaviors that are intended to intimidate, control, and instill fear in the victim. The Canadian criminal justice system currently treats domestic violence as an incident-based problem. So coercive and controlling behaviors are really outside of a justice response. But we know, and if you've worked on the front line, you know that abuse reported by survivors does not always manifest as physical assault. So amending our criminal code to recognize coercive and control will give police a tool to intervene before controlling behaviors escalate to physical violence. And this is important because experts have identified coercive control as an important precursor to femicide worldwide. Other countries have developed and adopted new offenses related to coercive and controlling behaviors in recent years, and I believe it's imperative that Canada do the same. 6 years ago, Canada committed to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, along with other member states. So the SDGs, in particular, SDG number 5, targets reductions in violence, including homicides and violence against women and girls. To achieve these targets, the SDGs require all levels of government to implement effective ways to stop violence before it occurs. So we need to see significant investments in violence prevention, and then we would be taking the right steps towards achieving these targets. The evidence is there, and investing in prevention is the most cost-effective way to reduce violence and enhance community safety. So we have a lot of work to do, and I know I'm preaching probably to the converted here, but we have the knowledge and we have the expertise to do it. We can learn from best practices, and the right time is now. I reaffirm my commitment to working towards ending violence and victimization through prevention in my role as Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime. And I'd like to thank again the CMNCP for inviting us to collaborate on this important guide. My hope is that it circulates widely and that it provides practical information to community service providers and leaders who can actually develop actions to prevent violence before it happens. Violence is not inevitable. And my good friend and colleague, Dr. Irvin Waller, always says this: it's not inevitable. We can stop violence, we can save lives, and we can prevent harm over the long term that arises from violence. So thank you for tuning in to this launch today. Merci, miigwech.
Thank you so much for that, Heidi. Merci beaucoup. And I really want to just reiterate how great it's been to have the chance to collaborate with your office on this project and on just ongoing commitment to this work. I think it's really inspiring that in your role as the Federal Ombudsman for Victims, it's recognition that, ultimately the best thing that can be done for victims is to prevent them from becoming victims in the first place. So thank you so much for that. So next, we will hear from Shannon Turner, who is the Executive Director of the Public Health Association of BC, as well as National Co-Chair of Violence Prevention Canada, who will speak to more of the public health perspective of prevention and violence prevention in the home more specifically.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's a privilege and an honor to be here and to be associated with the Peaceful Homes Report. I come to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, which represent the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. I am today wearing my scarf in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the importance of enhancing and strengthening our response to the criminal threat that poses both to the rights of women and to the identity of Indigenous persons. Very honored to be co-chairing this report with Corin Lightning Earl, and also thrilled to see Thunder Bay as one of the sponsors. I was born in Thunder Bay, and my first introduction to Thunderbird and the importance and significance of Thunderbird arose as a result of my childhood there, and that is a very important symbol to me moving forward in my work, as Thunderbird represents the protector of the people, especially in British Columbia. And so I just was thrilled to see Corin's commitment and connection to Thunder Bay and to the clan. So without further ado, I am serving as National Co-Chair of Prevention of Violence Canada and have been in that role for about a decade. That arose as a result of my connection to some really powerful public health advocates in Canada, including Dr. Irvin Waller and Laurie Snyder-McGregor, who is a practicing RN from Regional Waterloo District. It's also thrilling for me to be partnering with Felix Munger and Audrey Monette and the Canadian Municipal Crime Prevention Network for their leadership in addressing the opportunities that are represented by different orders of government to address this challenge. So Audrey, if we could go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what the public health approach is. What is the science of the public health approach? And how can we use it to actively address the importance of upstream primary prevention? So the three pillars of public health are prevention, protection, and promotion. And one of the things that's been reported brilliantly by Heidi Illingworth is our failure to undertake primary prevention. Canada participated in supporting the development of the World Report on Violence and Health in 2002. And it was my privilege to participate in a number of international meetings associated with prevention of violence. The World Report on Violence and Health made a number of recommendations for member states. And those recommendations called for the active participation of civil society in the creation of strategies to prevent violence and with all orders of government. In Canada, we still do not have an integrated strategic plan for violence prevention. One of the things this report did was it described the types of violence, and it also examined violence across the lifespan, both the direct and indirect consequences. So I'm just going to walk you through those quickly here. It's a mini lecture for those councillors and municipal leaders who are interested in how the concepts are organized as a way to intervene in violence. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you. So here's the WHO topology of violence. I'm sorry it's not a brilliant image. This is as good as it gets in terms of the desktoping that I was able to accomplish. And this was sent directly to me by my colleagues at WHO. So anyway, one of the things that this does is it describes the different types of violence. And again, related to Heidi's presentation, you can see that there are different forms of violence affecting us in different orders of organization. So we can have suicide and self-harm and self-abuse as self-directed violence. We can have violence in relationship, interpersonal violence between families and partners. We can have community level violence between acquaintances and strangers. And we can have collective violence, which is social, political, and economic. And as today is the day where we increase our awareness about the great harms that have been done to Indigenous women. I think it's important for Canada to acknowledge consequences of collective violence. Sorry. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what happens with violence? And I know that Lana is going to talk a little bit more about this ecological model. But here you can see some of the risk factors, and this is also represented in the report. It happens at different levels of organization. This is a socio-ecological model, and we can see the influences that impact the incidence of violence in community. So something like COVID-19, as Audrey pointed out, has the opportunity at the societal level to escalate violence at the individual level. And we talk about risk factors in the report, and we talk about societal risk factors in the report in particular. So I'd like to draw your attention to that when you have a chance to review it. I think that from the public health perspective, we're very, very concerned about the determinants of health that are represented here, like poverty, residential mobility or housing challenges, unemployment, drug use and drug trades. And again, that connects to collective violence, where we look at gang violence. And some of those other situational factors that where we've seen significant impacts on the safety and security of households resulting from COVID-19. So the public health approach requires us to examine the entire whole system, the whole context, and not to target individuals without considering the relationship to community. And that is why the municipal order of government is so powerful. And I can tell you from the public health perspective that most of the pro-social changes that have happened in this country in the last 25 years have been generated at the municipal level. Whether you're talking about seatbelt use or changes in smoking legislation or the use of bike helmets, Municipal governments have instituted bylaws that have created significant shifts for the general population. Those population-based interventions mean that quality and equality can be emphasized for all citizenry. And so it is really vital that municipal leadership understand the significance of their roles and how they can shape the future for future generations. Next slide, please. Oh. So we talk about lifelong consequences of violence, and this is a infographic that was produced by CDC Atlanta, who had a very, very active violence prevention office and injury prevention office under the Obama administration. Of course, that was completely compromised under Donald Trump's administration, but is now being revitalized. And I know that we're watching very closely the policy developments and leadership that comes globally, and that helps inform our practice moving forward. But with respect to this slide, you can see that the consequences of harm in childhood lead to lifelong self-esteem issues, potential unsafe practices, mental health and addiction challenges, all kinds of what we call chronic health conditions that are not necessarily communicable, but really erode the quality of life of individuals. So when you expose someone to violence in their childhood, you're setting a pathway of ill health for them. That is a profound inequality, and we have a moral obligation to address it. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I mentioned here in our report that we discussed this in detail on page 16. I just wanted to get a beautiful copy of the cover. I think it's just so charming, and I love the artwork. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this is the CDC public health model. We have a slightly different graphic in the report, but what I want to emphasize to you is the use of science is critical, and that public health does not work in isolation. Yes, we can get, I see there's a note there, and yes, Helen, we can get that slide for you. Public health works across sectors. It identifies systemic population level threats, and it works across sectors to address those threats, pardon me. One of the things that's really important in violence prevention research and in implementation science connected to it is the fact that some of the solutions are counterintuitive. And we've seen many failures related to violence prevention interventions that actually result in escalations. We saw a lot of that in school-based violence programming because the science was not deployed. And the programs that were designed actually were triggering for individuals and school communities. So it is vital, in particular in this area, that we examine and study and adapt best practice to the local situation. And in that case, the public health approach never works in isolation of the community. The stakeholders, the people who are experiencing the problem, define the solution in partnership and collaboration with facilitators. Those facilitators should come from across various voices of leadership and persons experiencing the issue. Next slide, please. So here is, I'm going to walk you through what steps you take in order to, if I were working at the municipal level, these are the steps that I would want to take in order to ensure that the solutions that are defined and the options that are chosen have a good fit with the community. And this is well laid out in the report. So the first thing is a community-based assessment. What are the current issues related to violence? What are the causes? What are the locations? What are the risk factors? And what are the consequences? And let me just mention that use of police data alone will not give you the full picture. When you look at the Cardiff model in the UK, for example, in Wales, they identified hotspots for violence that were not being reported to police. And so you really have to examine a wide range of data and talk with community members. And those solutions then become community driven and community adaptive. So first thing you need to do is establish an advisory committee, and that committee should be made up of a cross section of representatives of different interest groups within the community experiencing the problem, including leadership, but not limited to. In fact, if you do not have voices from the communities that are experiencing the greatest threats and the greatest risks, it's likely that your solution will not be effective. So it has to be user-driven. We talk about collecting and analyzing quantitative data. This is the information that we have through information systems that are sitting within different databases in government and different orders of government. And also, obviously, in this case, you are going to look at police-related data, but you're also going to look at social services data. You're going to look at, sorry, I'm distracted by a wonderful note from my friend Christiane Sadler. Christiane, thank you. Anyway, so we're going to look at the quantitative data, and we're going to try and establish a foundation, a base understanding, a map, a picture of what's going on in our community. And then we're going to map the strengths and assets of the community. What is it that the community has that is unique? And I can tell you that even in, I worked at one point with a population of veterans who were living in subsidized housing with very marginalized conditions. And they, to the casual observer, would not have had many assets identified. But if you knew the community, you would know that they had codes and signals for looking after each other, that they had check-ins that they did on a daily basis to make sure people's needs were met. They had a number of community-based interventions that supported each other's care. And that would not have been obvious to the outside observer. So those types of inquiries are important. Finally, not finally, but next, collect and analyze the qualitative data, talk to people about the issues, about the threats they're experiencing, and then develop a report for feedback and sharing with community members. So that's your assessment. The next few slides I'll go through a little more quickly because I'm running out of time, and it's all in the report. But most importantly, look at what cost-effective approaches would allow you to respond to the problems and priority areas identified in the community, a safety assessment. And look at adapting those interventions to your local context. Ensure that you collaborate across sectors and that you are paying attention to violence in the home in particular, because this is a place where support and generating support is really critical in interrupting and intervening in the cycle of violence. Next. So then once you've got your plan established, you need to get organized about implementation, make sure people are trained, and monitor for efficiency and sustainability. Next, please. Once you have moved forward with your plan, it's really important to undertake monitoring and evaluation. What worked, what didn't work. Make sure that you have got accountability measures in place so that you have people overseeing the utility of this process and figuring out where the best fixes can be implemented, what shifts need to take place, to use Lana's acronym. And then make sure that you're reporting back to the municipality to propose strategic directions, either for increased investment or changes in specific problem areas. Next. I did want to close by talking to you a little bit about health promotion. This principle underpins much of what we do in public health. It's a commitment to working collaboratively across sectors and to address challenges identified by the community of interest. As I said earlier, it's supported by evidence-based approaches. It is enfranchising and empowering. It is often settings-based, where in this approach, the community advises and builds a solution based on their supported assessment of need. Health promotion enhances the agency of individuals and organizations within your community to tailor solutions to local conditions and contexts. It is a moral approach which requires that no solutions are proffered to the community of interest unless the community determines they have value. And I think that the public health approach, with its investment in equity, in science, in evidence-based approaches, in inclusive collaboration, is a strategic mechanism for us to move forward to meet the call that has been emphasized by the SDGs around protecting the rights and safety of women and children, around creating and supporting a democratic institution and engagement of citizenry in planning and resolving local issues, challenges, and conflicts. So those are my comments for today. Once again, significant appreciation to the Canadian Municipal Crime Prevention Network. I would just like to say that public health does engage in surveillance and monitoring, and that ensures that public health issues get the attention they deserve and the resolution they demand. Thank you so much. Merci et miigwech.
Thank you so much for that, Shannon. And I think that, you know, the planning process and the public health approach definitely resonates with a lot of work that's being done locally in terms of crime prevention more broadly, and how it can be applied in this case for violence in the home more specifically. That definitely resonates. So thank you so much for those remarks. I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Professor Lana Wells, who is the Brenda Strafford Chair in the Prevention of Domestic Violence at the University of Calgary. And Lana will speak a little bit more about systemic change and the role of municipalities in that regard.
Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to be here today, surrounded by so many people who care so deeply about stopping violence before it starts. I just wanted to quickly point out, I was introduced as a doctor, and I don't. I'm an associate professor and the Brenda Strafford Chair. And I've been at the university for almost 11 years, so I feel like I have several doctorates, but I just wanted to point that out. And I do want to thank the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention for releasing this report, because I think municipalities have a critical role. We've done lots of research in that area and would encourage you to come to our website. I wanted to acknowledge I'm located on Treaty 7 and the home to Métis Nation of Alberta. And I'd also like to express my solidarity in the Red Dress Day and stopping all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls. For today's presentation, as was pointed out, I was asked to focus on systems and prevention, and specifically around some of the tensions and problems that are getting in the way to moving upstream to prevent violence before it starts. And so I wanted to put up a definition that we use at SHIFT and just talk about a few key concepts, and then I'll dig into some of the tensions. When I'm talking about prevention today, I'm focused on primary prevention, which is preventing initial perpetration and victimization of domestic and sexual violence by scaling up interventions that target the structural and cultural conditions that produce and reinforce violence and discrimination. So what do I mean by structural and cultural conditions that produce and reinforce violence? Well, Shannon pointed out the social ecological model, and hopefully everyone who's on the call has seen this model and the importance of it, because it really helps to understand that we actually need to be working at all levels. But when we're thinking about going upstream and focusing on root causes, we need to turn our attention to community and societal level risk factors and protective factors. So really the purpose of primary prevention and the research that I've been leading for about 11 years is focusing on addressing the factors at these levels. So we really want to figure out how to stop the risk of increasing and experiencing violence, and how to advance the factors that buffer against these risks. So I think focusing on systems, structural and cultural change is obviously critical to stopping violence before it starts. And today I'm going to share with you what I think is getting in the way of doing this type of work and the role cities and municipalities can play in primary prevention. So one of the first problems I wanted to talk about is located in the human services sector, supported by funders and policymakers. We often default to what we know, and what we know is how to design and implement short-term programs. Funders and agencies have built an infrastructure around programs. So this means all of our training, our funding, our staffing, our evaluation and reporting mechanisms are all around programmatic responses. And trying to do non-programmatic or innovation or working at structures and systems level is really like trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. So we need to go beyond the programs for problems model. So I think we can all agree we need more tools in our behavioral toolbox, and they need to complement each other. More specifically, I think we need to be investing in these multiple approaches at different levels, which we talked about at the social ecological model, which really is about investing in our capacities to change norms, to surface and change culture, and to advance systems change. And I think cities and communities can do this by making investments that go beyond programs. So thinking about more flexible funding that actually supports research and development, that supports collective impact initiatives and collaboration with diverse sectors. So I want to dig into a little bit about what I mean by this. So we know training and policy are the two most common approaches to changing behaviors related to gender-based violence and discrimination. And while both are very important, the research shows that they are ineffective unless they are coupled with interventions that are focused on culture and social norm change. So that's the part in the middle of the triangle, which is what we've been designing and testing and advancing practices since 2017. And through this work, we've learned that human decision-making and behavior isn't as rational or straightforward as we've been led to believe. The emerging fields of behavioral science and behavioral economics have really radically changed our ideas about how humans make decisions and what impacts our behavior. So I think we need to be integrating these insights into our prevention investments and work. So if you think about our traditional approach to, in our sector, to changing violence and sexist behaviors, it's looked something like this. We work with, let's say, men to build their knowledge, shift their attitudes, and cultivate the motivation to change, and then the change. Well, research actually shows there is actually a statistically weak correlation between intention to engage in a target behavior and actually engaging in that target behavior. Intention translates to behavior change about 27 to 39% of the time. So this linear approach does work in some circumstances, but it does not account for the many ways in which our physical and sociocultural environments also influence our behaviors. So research shows that contextual factors like social norms, culture, physical and social design, and the behaviors of others in the settings in where we play and learn and work and worship can actually override individual intentions, attitudes, or beliefs. So it turns out the environment's effects on behavior are a lot stronger than most people expect. So what does this mean for our work? Well, the more we can better understand these contextual factors, the more we can leverage them to create lasting change. So as we think about prevention efforts, we need to be considering how to leverage social cultural environments to change behavior. And of course, this means targeting systems and institutions is key. So let's move to problem number 2, which is closely tied to problem number 1. And we describe it, I paraphrase Peter Drucker, and I say that culture actually eats policy for breakfast. So to be clear, I'm not saying that policy is unimportant. I'm just saying, like programs, policy is not enough to prevent violence. You've probably all had the experience of seeing a policy have limited impact because it runs counter to the dominant culture. So let me give you a good Canadian example to explain where the policy runs counter to the culture. We know that lots of hockey leagues in Canada have policies that prohibit hazing. Many organizations not only have policies, but speak out on the issue. But hazing, including physical and sexual assaults, still happen because it's part of hockey's culture. So when you think about it, we have lots of great policies and legislation in this country to advance gender equity and stop violence. We have a Pay Equity Act, a national poverty reduction strategy. We have changes to the labor code on sexual misconduct and violence. We have longer parental leave policies, including paternity leave, lots of women and empowerment strategies and entrepreneurship, and of course, increasing women's involvement in politics and boards. But we know, and as the report points out, we're still seeing high rates of male violence against women and girls. And as you heard from the report, the numbers keep escalating, specifically in the crisis we're in currently. I also want to point out that we're still seeing huge gender inequities. A report published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives stated that if we keep going at the current rate of change, it will take 164 years to close the economic gender gap in Canada. Well, the gap is even larger for racialized and Indigenous women. And now with the pandemic, we all know it's becoming even wider. So policy can only take us so far. We have to change culture. So a solution is learning how to make the invisible visible. And that's not easy. And at Shift, we've been developing several processes and activities to help men surface aspects of the culture that dominates themselves and their settings. We have found that men are supported to identify, when they're supported to identify harmful aspects of their culture, when they're able to be more intentional and effective in changing and redesigning their own culture, we're seeing the changes, and we're calling this the changing context approach, and it's on our website if people are interested, and I'm happy to put this report in the chat. But I also wanted to add, while we're working with men and male dominated settings, I think all of us need to be doing this in our communities, in our organizations, and within ourselves. And so I've posted a few books here up on the screen that we're using to help integrate how to surface and change culture and norms. So let's move to problem number 3. Men have historically been excluded from gender equality and gender-based violence prevention efforts, and those that are involved aren't very well supported. As educator and activist Jackson Katz so eloquently put it in his TED Talk that went viral in 2013, violence against women isn't a woman's issue, it is a men's issue. Katz argued that most of our language and measures focus on changing women, not men. And it's time to start focusing our energy on the changes we seek in men. And you'll see from this federal budget that just got released, there was 105 million targeting men and boys in Canada, which is the first time it's shown up in a federal budget. So I think there'll be opportunity to think about this at the local level. So if we want more men in the anti-violence movement, we need to change the narrative to be more inspirational versus diagnostic. We need to create more brave spaces where men can learn and make mistakes without judgment. And we need to create more opportunities for men to explore healthy masculinities and gender socialization with other men. And I think all municipalities can be investing in building a local infrastructure of male allies to support the anti-violence movement. Okay, let's move to problem number 4. Apparently there was a technology revolution and most of us in the human service sector missed it. Data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms, open source data, data equity frameworks, surveillance capitalism. Have you heard of these terms? Many of us missed the 4th industrial revolution, which is really a trend towards automation and data exchange. And there's so many fears around data in our sector. There's fears around collecting data, sharing data, and fears around how the story will be told. So these fears mean that we are relying on data that is often old and isolated from the broader picture of what is actually happening in our communities. And really, the pandemic has highlighted this issue. So one solution that I'm hoping you will get super jazzed about is called Data to Action. Right now, it's a provincial collaboration launched here in Alberta, but we're hoping all the provinces and territories will come on board. The impetus for the project started at the beginning of COVID, as we do not have a central repository of comprehensive cross-analyzed violence data in Alberta and actually in Canada. So for decades, our sector has used certain counts to understand rates of violence, like police reports and shelter beds being accessed. And those counts are important, but we wanted to broaden our measures and take into account multiple data points. We also wanted to leverage new technologies to monitor COVID's impacts, like open source data, big data. I mean, the private sector has been doing this for years. If you think about your ads on your Facebook or Instagram account, that is artificial intelligence knowing what you like because they've created an algorithm based on your interactions. Well, how do we use this for good? So we wanted to better inform services, better inform policy in an adaptive real time. And so the project is really about gathering data from multiple sources, including agencies and groups in Alberta, and creating a real-time dashboard that will be able to monitor what's happening and then target prevention efforts in particular areas and communities. The Data to Action Initiative is a partnership between Help Seeker, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's a B Corp tech company. It's a partnership with the University of Calgary, and Sagesse Impact, which is a collective impact provincial organization here in Alberta. Each of us is playing a very distinct role. The technology and systems mapping is Help Seeker's role. The research and knowledge mobilization is the university's role. And the Impact's role is really supporting the capacity of their members to share their data and to get better at actually collecting data that can actually tell us what's happening on the ground. So the last problem I wanted to raise, as the report acknowledged, here in Canada and around the world, incidents of domestic and sexual violence have intensified under COVID-19, triggered by the social and economic impact of the public health emergency. And as was mentioned earlier on, confinement and stay-at-home orders, increased stress due to loss of jobs, an increase in unhealthy coping mechanisms, along with the lack of access to formal supports have all contributed to rates of violence in the home. The world has changed significantly in the past year. It's changed in how we live, how we work, how we learn, and how we're socializing. but I think there's a reason for hope for a better future. We have an opportunity right now to fundamentally reshape our institutions and systems and our ways of being. A crisis alerts us to the limitations of our existing models. We see with different eyes, like right now, you're all in my home. This is an opportunity to blow up everything we think and rethink it. We get to redefine how we think about fundamental aspects of our society, like health and race and gender, and we have an opportunity to influence systems and institutions to create justice and equity. I know I covered a lot today. I have a lot more that I'd love to dig into. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to set aside another time. And I really look forward to our discussion together. Thank you.